So let me introduce our first guest speaker, Katherine Lampen from Deloitte. She's a partner at Deloitte and heads up their sustainability division. And actually, I think it's fantastic the way that this is sort of unfolded when you do these interviews and you invite the speakers that you really want for an event like this. It kind of all falls beautifully into place because Baz referred to specifically the disclosures that the TCFD are recommending, which is an industry agnostic, I know, facility, if you like, or toolkit. So maybe, Katherine, if you can kind of help us understand what the context of that might mean for our industry, for broadcasting, that'd be fantastic. And I will disappear and leave you to it.
Absolutely.
Over to you.
Thank you very much, Tricia. Can we show the slide deck, please? Perfect. Okay, so what I want to do over the next kind of 5 to 10 minutes is talk to you a bit about the TCFD and how companies are trying to manage climate risk at the moment. So over the last 3 years, we've seen a massive change in how companies are considering integrating climate risk into everything they do. And that's in a large part been driven by the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, which was an initiative that came out of the Financial Stability Board. They launched a number of recommendations, 11 in 2017, to integrate climate risk into mainstream financial filings. With the reason behind that saying, you know, actually environmental factors are a negative externality and they're not priced in the same way as other things that we value. And the idea behind it was, you know, to see how the climate crisis would impact different companies. So making them provide transparent disclosures so stakeholders can make informed decisions. Now, when this first came out, I think companies were a bit hesitant of this is another sustainability reporting framework. And you know, there are, for those of you that are involved directly in sustainability, you know that there are lots and lots of reporting standards out there already. But this took on a very different route because it spoke to investors directly, and it spoke to financial services in their language, you might say. So what we're seeing at the moment is countries mandating disclosures by TCFD, and we are also seeing lots of things come through from the EU, in particularly with financial services, making them integrate sustainable language and behaviours into all of the investment decisions, all of the banking decisions that are made. So that's having a knock-on impact on every other industry. So to give a bit of a flavour of that, over the last 3 years, there have been over 400 new pieces of legislation globally for banks, investment management firms and insurance firms to make sure that they are not exposed to stranded assets in the future. So yes, a stranded asset is, if you take, for example, an oil and gas company, and we've seen it very directly this week with BP's announcement, they're saying that actually in the future, a number of their oil fields will become not economic to drill from anymore because of the changing technology to do with green renewables. But also public sentiment on sustainability and climate change. And what we're seeing is banks changing their lending decisions on this. They're going through something called stress testing next year, which will make them report on how they are exposed to this through their lending. So all corporate loans, for example, the banks are integrating a climate risk lens on that at the moment. And then from an investment management perspective, so companies that are managing funds, they're going to have to say, you know, within their funds, how much of those funds are green. And so they're asking questions, they're engaging with companies in a much more direct way on what their kind of transition plan is to net zero. So we've seen institutional investors in particular targeting companies on this and actually saying that they're going to withdraw their funds if the disclosures according to the TCFD are not strong enough. So the TCFD, kind of going back to what that actually requires. So it's looking at the risks and opportunities for your company related to climate risk. And like I say, the recommendations are now becoming very mainstream in what they're requiring. If we can just move on to the next slide, please. So there are three areas of risks that you need to consider when you're looking at this space. So, you know, what are the physical impacts that might impact your business? So we've seen quite a lot of this over the last 18 months. So things from everything from flooding, hurricanes, fire risk. Those are the things that you can kind of easily see and that are covered in the news every day. So it might be the more obvious types of risks to your business. There are also something called transition risks, which are, you know, the possibility of things like higher operating costs, new legislation, environmental taxes that you might have to pay in the future as governments become much more stringent in what they're requiring corporates to do in this space. And then there's an opportunity space for this as well. You know, there's a cost saving impact, resource efficiency. And then I guess from a broadcasting perspective, there's opportunities around, you know, content programming in this space, and you know, the increased interest in how society is moving to a more sustainable world. So the three different areas that I've just discussed, you know, we've seen it already within this industry. So we've seen companies be impacted by damage to recording facilities. We've seen supply chain disruptions due to fires, for example, in Australia earlier this year. We've seen companies have direct challenge from in their AGMs on the content that they're producing around climate change. And we've seen companies who have moved to a more sustainable way of working and have reduced costs quite significantly, particularly because of the quite significant air travel exposure in this space. So TCFD recommends that you use scenario analysis to dig into this a bit more. So it basically says, well, what will happen to your business if there is a 1.5, a 2 or a 4 degree world in terms of temperature change? And to give you a flavour of what that would mean, so a 4 degree change would result in a £20 trillion global economic loss per year. So it absolutely kind of dwarfs what's going on with COVID and the financial crisis back in 2008. If we can just move on to the next slide, please. Thank you. So in terms of how this impacts your business, and I think we heard it in the last talk, you know, this is not something that is solely for the sustainability team, although their SME knowledge at this point comes in exceptionally valuable. So disclosure is required in 4 areas. So governance, who is responsible for climate risk in your business? Now, this in the last 10 years has traditionally been the sustainability department or the environmental department, but now this is a board level responsibility, and that structure, right from you know, how you set strategy at board level needs to be integrated into everything you do. So we're seeing, you know, the Financial Reporting Council look at how companies are taking up this governance responsibility for climate risk. We're also seeing a rise across all corporates globally in having a board level committee on sustainability that reports in the same way as the remuneration and risk committees. We're seeing from a strategy perspective, we're seeing how companies are trying to achieve net zero. So that is how they're reducing their emissions, how they're changing decision making relating to what they do on a day-to-day basis to reduce their emissions, and then finally offsetting, which is kind of the final resort in this space. They're looking at how they're future-proofing their strategies in a rapidly changing world. So, what does that mean for content in the future? And then from a risk management perspective, they're looking at how you manage and respond to physical and transitional risks. I think if you looked at most annual reports 3 or 4 years ago, they wouldn't have climate change or environmental risk as a factor at all. We're seeing that change dramatically at the moment, with most companies now thinking about these broader environmental and social risks. And I think obviously with the impact of COVID, we're seeing an even more intense look at that, because obviously that's had a massive impact on a number of companies and was a risk that isn't traditionally considered. We're seeing at I guess a broadcasting production level, environmental and climate change factors being integrated into risk assessments that you would do like a health and safety assessment. But we are seeing, again, a lot of involvement from chief risk officers in this space. And then finally around metrics and targets. So we're seeing much better accounting for emissions in this area at the moment, with much more stringent targets. I think we've seen a practice over the last kind of 6 to 12 months of a lot of companies going out with net zero ambitions without really thinking about how they're going to achieve that. So, getting those accounting practices right is really important. And ultimately what TCFD requires is you to integrate your emissions and the consequent price of those emissions into your financial statements. So that will then lead to, could lead to potential impairments, which is what we've seen with the BP's £15 billion write-down this week. So that's a quick guide through TCFD. There is a massive document that you can read which tells you in a lot more detail the types of KPIs you should report, the types of governance structures that exist in this space, and ideas around strategy. But I'll hand it back to you, Tricia, and so you can, if there's any questions.
Yes, there are a couple of questions. So just let me remind those who've just joined us what the format is here today. We've got 2 more official speakers, but actually a surprise speaker coming on as well at the very end. And I'm going to ask a couple of questions now that have just come up in the course of while you've been talking, Katherine, and then we're going to hand over to Kira. And at the very end, we'll bring all of you back together for more questions. So do keep the questions coming in, and we'll try and answer as many as we can. So the first thing that's come up is from Susie, just made a comment really, but I think it is worth you probably trying to help us expand this a little bit and understand this. Wondering how legislative change and statutory requirements might play out, I guess specifically in the context of broadcasting.
Yeah, so what we're expecting, I guess the first thing to happen in this space is through the EU non-financial reporting framework, which basically states what companies have to report in this area in their annual reporting. And they've already said that they're going to integrate TCFD requirements into what they require. So we'll see it coming through from the reporting angle. But the government, the UK government, has set obviously a really ambitious goal around net zero. So I think what we're going to see over the next 6 months is a huge change in the number of additional regulations coming in the UK specifically on this. We know that the government has an ambition to be at the very forefront of this, and one of the ways of doing that is through statutory instruments. So we're expecting to see, I guess, a variety of different, things happen. The financial services side of it is really pushing what's happening here. So I would say that's had more of an impact than the regulation coming through. The fact that the banks are going to have to say, investment managers are going to have to say how exposed they are to organisations that might have a risk in this space is really driving change at the moment. And we've seen companies that are not necessarily high impact, like the oil and gas firms, be targeted and being pulled out as examples on this. So that's creating quite a lot of change. And then I think globally we're seeing quite significant changes in regulatory regimes to integrate TCFD at the moment. So it really is seen as something that's quite robust, and also I think eventually TCFD will be extended to other sustainability areas and potentially even social areas as well. So it's something to look forward to for all of us.
Do you think that it will remain, I mean, this is a question from me, do you think it will remain voluntary, or do you think at some point, I mean, it actually touches on a question from Neil. He says, government controls have been key to slowing COVID. With climate change promising to be far worse than COVID, isn't dramatic ongoing government intervention essential? And I think you've almost answered that in your previous answer. But will it remain just something we do altruistically because we think it's a good idea, or because it's a good idea for the long-term stability of our business, or is it going to...
I mean, we've seen governments across the world post-COVID say that companies are only going to get loans going forwards if they have met certain sustainability criteria. And I imagine that there will eventually be quite a lot more regulation in this space. We know from FY22, companies will be mandated to report on TCFD in the UK, but it varies globally. So, you know, the US is a little bit different. But then, for example, in Japan, this is already mandatory, and companies have been reporting for over a year in this space.
Right. I think we better leave it there, because I'm really keen to hear from the rest of the speakers, and then we'll bring you back, because I think there are a couple of questions that came in the advance, questions that we might want to unpack, but they may get answered by Kira or Richard in the meantime. Thank you so much. We'll talk to you again in about half an hour.